been sufficient time now to absorb the ramifications of the federal budget. The Australian on the 12th of October came out with the headline, "Nation Backs PM's COVID Budget." In fact, the budget was a disaster on a disaster. It delivered a bill for $1 trillion to what pollsters say or suggest is a grateful nation. But the pollsters have already said to you, not that long ago, that Mr. Shorten would become Prime Minister, that Hillary Clinton would be President, that the United Kingdom remain a Franco-German appendage within the European Union. And years ago, that Australians wanted to change the constitution into that of a fake republic, a politician's republic. The fact is that when Beijing duplicitously released the COVID virus onto the world, the National Cabinet had essentially 4 tasks. Firstly, they had to control entry into Australia, and given that Australia is a remote island nation, this should not have been too difficult. They had to help to discourage the virus through common sense rules and conventions about hygiene. Most importantly, they had to protect the vulnerable. And fourth, they should recover reparations for those responsible, namely the Beijing communists. Unfortunately, they failed on each of these tasks, although they're taking advantage of our remoteness to claim great success. The fact is, our representative democracy is more captured than that of any comparable country. The great Edmund Burke explained the system of responsible democracy on the grounds that what we do is we elect our representatives. We choose our representatives for their judgment. Now, judgment requires common sense, honed in years of real life experience, through particularly a real job, and above all, a love of country. And I would say that no one who loves their country would stay in the Paris Accords, which are doing such damage to their countries. In fact, the one significant politician who has decided that he cannot stay in the Paris Accords is Donald Trump, because he saw what that would do, how it would wreck the American economy. The fact is that most politicians today don't have judgment. They're politicians usually with no real life experience, rarely having for long a real job. They're chosen not for merit, as they used to be. They're chosen because of their loyalty to a given power broker and their self-interest in promoting the interests of that power broker. The problem is that, having no judgment, politicians rely not on a judgment which is not there. They rely very much on computer modelling, as they have in relation to climate change, as they did in relation to the virus. Now, the great Dr. Box, the great Anglo-American statistician, says of computer modelling, it is always wrong, because it can never replicate the real world. Garbage in, garbage out. They also rely on unelected, so-called experts, but they never seem to rely on their own judgment. And they can't, because they rarely have any real-life experience. The National Cabinet had no judgment when it made its decision on the virus, but they also chose, for some curious reason, to ignore world's best practice. Now, world's best practice comes from Taiwan. Taiwan has long had experience with viruses coming across the short distance from China into Taiwan, and they know how to deal with it. It took me not long at the time of the National Cabinet meeting and making its terrible decision to impose a national lockdown, that Taiwan had world's best practice. They knew how to control entry. They knew how to protect, or who to protect. And above all, they realized that you don't need to lock down the most productive parts of your economy. Why did the National Cabinet do this? They did it because of deference to the Beijing communists. And that deference, if you doubt it, can be shown in the vast amount of premium and strategic assets in this country, now under the control of the communists from China. Remember, the corporations from China are all subservient to the directions of the Chinese Communist Party. Had they followed world's best practice, they could have achieved what Taiwan achieved, or even better, because we're remote. Taiwan has had 7 deaths. We've had more than 100 times that in Australia. They've had no lockdown. They didn't wreck their economy. The modelling that the Cabinet, the National Cabinet, decided to rely on came from a source, or influenced by a source, which has been so exaggerated in the past they have been wrong. This is from the Imperial College in London, and it was influenced by that. They've been so wrong that nobody with any sense would have followed them again. But the modelling they had on the table also contained a major error, an error in filling in the columns correctly. And it predicted that there would be a daily need in Australia for 35,000 intensive care units. That would have meant that something like 120,000, 130,000 people would be in hospital, although the modelling didn't say that. It said about a quarter of that would be in hospital. It was an obvious error. Not one member of the National Cabinet noticed that, nor did their armies of advisors that each of them have, all employed at taxpayers' expense. And they took an idiotic decision, and that is to treat the modelling as a state secret. So you, people with common sense, couldn't have noticed this and told the governments that something was terribly wrong at the time. It would have been obvious to any of us. And it took me not long to realise that when I looked into it, that a lockdown was a serious error and it would be a disaster, and that has been confirmed by our experience. Since then, experts across the world, Professor Gupta from Oxford and leading experts from Cambridge and Harvard and Stanford, are saying that lockdowns are bad medically and they achieve nothing in relation to diminishing a virus. Even the WHO, the World Health Organization, has said this. There's much more that could be said in criticism of the National Cabinet, which has significantly failed in this regard. The point is, we must never let this happen again. Never again. There's already talk overseas of using lockdowns for other reasons, using them for climate change. As we know, the climate's always changing. That's the name they've chosen because global warming seemed to have stood still, so they had to use a different name and call it climate change. Now, I would suggest there are 2 solutions which should be adopted immediately and together at the same time. First, we should have a sound royal commission to see what happened, what went wrong in relation to the response. Otherwise, it's going to be hidden, and there are too many in the mainstream press who are going to support the government because the press does like, the media do like reporting and encouraging panic so that we get frequent reports, almost daily reports, of outbreaks everywhere. Originally, incidentally, we were told that the whole purpose of the lockdown was to flatten the curve so that it would be easier for the hospitals to cope with the virus, flattening the curve. Now they've turned it into getting rid of the virus, which you probably can't do until you have an effective vaccine. And they're also saying in the budget the whole thing depends upon a vaccine being produced next year. So the politicians, having tasted power, the power they can have to minutely rule your lives and tell us what to do and wreck business while preserving the public sector, we are in a very dangerous situation. We have to make sure this doesn't happen again. So first, there must be a good royal commission. There's one person who should head that commission, or at least play a significant role in it. And that is a politician who has been commended internationally for his work as a Minister of Health in planning for future pandemics, although his planning, unfortunately, wasn't preserved after he stopped being Minister of Health, and that is the much maligned Tony Abbott. He is a politician they should have brought into the National Cabinet because he knows what he's talking about. He's been commended for his work. He should at least be involved, either running the Royal Commission, and he does have a law degree, and anyway, you do have a counsel assisting, usually a QC who can guide the Commission on legal points. There doesn't have to be one Royal Commission, there can be more than one. Tony Abbott should play a role in that. The second thing to do is to take the pub test. The pub test was introduced into Australian discussions, into Australian discourse by Alan Jones. And his famous line about some stupid idea of some politician was, well, that doesn't pass the pub test. And all that means is it doesn't pass common sense. And Australians, rank and file Australians who've had real jobs, lived in the real world, unlike the politicians, and who love their country, have common sense, and they can be relied on to play a more significant role in the governance of this country. In the state of Michigan, in the United States, the governor has been found by the Supreme Court of Michigan to have done what Australian politicians are doing, issuing regulations, minutely controlling the lockdown, imposing all sorts of restrictions. And they say she's gone too far, she didn't have the authority to do that, and these have been found to be unlawful. And in addition to that, in addition to a very strong decision of the Supreme Court against the governor, a petition or a number of petitions are circulating, which, if signed by 25% of the electors of Michigan, mean that she will have to face a new election, a recall election. Many states in the United States and one province in Canada have recall elections, which means that the people, by petition, with a certain percentage of the electorate having to sign it, can recall a government or a particular politician to another election. It's not often used, but it hangs like a sword of Damocles over the heads of a politician, of politicians. And they know that if they abuse their powers, they could always be recalled to a special recall election. The second thing, which is important in utilising the common sense of the great majority of Australians, is to institute referendums. We've got one in relation to constitutional change, but we can't trigger it. There was a proposal that we should trigger it, but that was put aside by arguments that the system of government would look after that, but it hasn't. We should be able to, Australians should be able, by petition of a certain percentage of electors, to propose a law which if the majority wanted, would have to be introduced, to repeal laws, to repeal treaties, to approve particular large treaties, to change constitutional interpretations by the High Court. We should be able to do all of this. This is direct democracy. We would need a convention to do that. Australians should be pressing for a convention to do this so that we can take back power from the politicians. We can make the politicians accountable 24/7. Now, there's a reference on this site where this video is showing to a petition that you can look at, which summarises how Australians would take back their country. And in the meantime, important things are going on in relation to the most important election in the world, and probably since the Civil War in America, and that's the current presidential election. Don't believe for a moment the polls. Most of them are taken out by a media which has been prepared. This is the mainstream American media, a media which has become the propaganda arm of the Democrat Party, which has been captured by the far left. Don't believe them. If you want to hear more about that, there's a link here in the text to this video to a discussion on this that I had with Alan Jones on Sky Television, which you can look at if you wish. So Australians, my fellow Australians, the solution is take back your country.